gosh.
Back when online dating first started, 2002, before Match and that stuff, there was something called Salon. Girl looked great online, seemed like she could write well. We met up at a restaurant. She looked nothing like her photo.
We show up and this guy is shows up with his little dinky backpack, which there's nothing wrong with a dinky backpack, but he just shows up. He's a little bit hiding, and I see him, and he's shorter than I am. And I was like, oh, okay, well, you're not 6'1", but all right, we'll flow with this anyways. It's fine. I lie about my height too. Maybe you're super awesome.
Being flaked on. That's pretty much it. Not only once, but a couple times by the same girl. So, yeah.
I prepared this pirated CD, and I had prepared it, and I was going to give it to her. Unfortunately, I put it in my pocket, and I just sat on it, really broke in half, and then I had nothing to give her.
We first sit down, we've been there for about 5 minutes, haven't even ordered a first glass of wine yet or anything to drink, and she straight up asked me if I wanted to go out again.
A blind date, and she was
Started talking a little bit about what we have in common, and I said, yeah, I play, competitive ultimate frisbee. I played for my varsity team at one point. You said that you're an athlete. What do you do? He's like, I play Wii tennis.
I wish I had a good story for you, but they all end well.
Worst things that could happen on a first date for me would be me acting super cool and crossing my leg over and kicking the person under the table, or reaching for my drink and completely spilling it on them. This has never happened to me.
And then at the end the bill comes. And so I had, I think, a salad and a lemonade for breakfast, and he had ordered pancakes and toast and eggs and bottomless mimosas. And the bill comes, and it's a typical first date, which is always really awkward. No one really knows what they're supposed to do on it. Do I pay? Does he pay? Who asked who out? And he looks at it, and it's a $65 bill, not including tax or anything like that. He goes, so split it 50-50?
I suffered through appetizers and dinner, and then at that point, I faked that I got a page from the hospital, and that is the worst first date I've ever been on.
My worst date, my goodness. I can't even remember. I think they were all good.
You were just that much of a baller.
Pardon?
You were that much of a stud.
Yeah. I know a couple of sexy women.
Did you catch it at the end where he says, I know some sexy women? I mean, you think he's gonna be this sweet love story, he's an older guy, and I love some sexy women. Yeah. Well, I am thrilled, so genuinely excited to be with you here tonight as we talk about dating, which I'm sure brings up a myriad of reactions for everyone. And maybe you think, I love dating. I love going out to eat and getting to know someone and asking them thoughtful questions and really connecting. Or maybe you think, I hate dating. I don't know what to do or what to say. I don't know how to ask somebody out. I don't know where to go. It's so much pressure. And some of you might be thinking, I find dating exhausting. Maybe you've been on a string of first dates and you're just tired of going on the same date over and over again. But I really believe that while dating brings up so much for us, it can also be fun. But there's this meme I found that I really enjoyed. It says, yeah, dating is cool, but have you ever heard of stuffed crust pizza? Hopefully, our dating lives are or will be better than stuffed crust pizza in the coming season. Well, dating can be hard. It can be difficult. It brings up vulnerabilities and insecurities, and it has this way of putting us in touch with our inadequacies and the things we fear most about ourselves. If any of you have read the book Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, he has this great analogy where a person walks into a basement and they turn on the light, and when they do, they see all these rats scurrying around on the floor. And he says that our impulse is to immediately turn off the light and then blame the light for the thing that it showed us. And in the same way, we can often say, I hate dating, But really, what we probably hate is that dating illuminates our insecurities. It puts us in touch with our unmet desires. And so we're going to wade through dating tonight, because at the end of the day, dating is two people, works best when you're responsible, well-communicating people, but two people who are getting to know each other, you get to know yourself, you get to know the other person, and then you're seeing if you are compatible together. And that's really all that dating is, but it's obviously more complicated for us than that. So as people who love God, people who want to follow Christ in all the areas of our lives, how do we date? Well, the Bible says nothing really about dating at all. Because when it was written, nobody dated in the way that we date today. So the Bible doesn't say a lot about dating, but it does say a lot about how we are to treat one another. And it does say a lot about how we make decisions and choices. And it does talk a lot about how God can guide us in our everyday choices, which would include who and how we date. So we're going to go through tonight a chronological look at a dating relationship, all the way from how do I find somebody to how do I stop seeing this person? The whole range. Or how do I propose? Because maybe it'll work out. So before we get to that part, we want to look at two general principles that we want to apply to the whole of our dating life. So the first is that God actually guides us in our dating. For some reason, when it comes to dating, we often think of just God providing us a person, and we forget that He helps us find the person. He helps us in the relationship. He works in our character, in the other person's character, and He really cares about us in our dating, and that we can go to Him for guidance as we're dating. So there's a scripture from Proverbs. It's in chapter 2, verses 3 through 5, and it says, "If you indeed cry out for insight and raise your voice to understanding, if you seek it like silver and search for it as hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God." Where we really can ask God for insights and feedback and thoughts, both in prayer and in scripture, of sort of what His opinion is of our dating and what's going on for us and the other person. So throughout the dating process, God can really guide us. Now, in addition to God guiding us, so often in dating, we want assurances. And we want guarantees. We want to know that it's going to work out. We want to know that we're not going to look stupid. We want to know that it'll be worth the risk to date. Oftentimes, especially in the Christian dating culture, we want to know that they're the person before we ever go to dinner. And it's true. You totally know it's true. And that's just not the way that it works, because God trusts you to make decisions. And I know sometimes we really want God to break it down and give us an envelope with the person's name and where to be and how to find them. But God's working in you to become the kind of person who can choose a good mate. He trusts you to make those choices. Now, as He is trusting us, we're trusting Him. And then the second thing we want to acknowledge is that we can take initiative in our dating life. So God is guiding us, but then there's this parallel track of responsibility for us to do our part, to put ourselves out there, to try as many things as possible, to give God as much room to help us in our love life. So if you think about the book of Joshua, which is in the Old Testament, now the Israelite people have come out of slavery, they've come out of the wilderness, and they're sort of perched atop this hill overlooking the promised land, the land that God has for them. And in Joshua 1, 5 through 9, it says, it's God's giving instructions to Joshua. And He says, "I will be with you. I won't give up on you. I won't leave you. Strength and courage. You're going to lead this people to inherit the land that I promised to give their ancestors. Give it everything you have, heart and soul. Make sure you carry out the revelation that Moses commanded you, every bit of it. Don't get off track, either left or right, so as to make sure you get to where you're going. And don't for a minute let this book of Revelation be out of your mind. Ponder and meditate on it day and night, making sure you practice everything written in it. Then you'll get where you're going. Then you'll succeed. Haven't I commanded you? Strength and courage. Don't be timid. Don't get discouraged. God, your God, is with you every step that you take." So God's basically saying, hey, I have this land for you, but you have to go and get it. You have to take initiative. You have to take action. And I mention that because typically we exhibit an incredible amount of initiative in every area of our life until it comes to our dating life. Or if we want to get a new job, we're on LinkedIn, we've edited our resume, we've told friends and family we're looking for a new job, you may use a headhunter. We take all these actionable steps to get a new job. Or if we want to become more healthy, we start working out more. Maybe you hire a personal trainer, maybe you find a workout buddy, maybe you learn how to cook and research recipes so you can cook well at home. So we take all these actionable steps to bring about the reality that we're wanting. But often when it comes to dating, we just say, well, God, where's my person? We just pray, which praying is important, but there's also a piece that we need to follow through on. So God guides and we take initiative, and they work hand in hand together. So let's jump in to the practical part of dating. So if you want to go on a date, the first thing you have to do is find somebody that you want to go on a date with. So the good news is that there's like 250 people in this room, which is pretty good. And then there's millions of people out there in the world. So the easiest way to find someone to go on a date with is to look around you. Is there anybody that you're attracted to? Is there anybody that you're intrigued by? You really can just ask somebody out because they seem interesting. So often in Christian dating, we think that we need to fast for 3 years, that we need to pray with all this intentionality, that we've got to wait for like a dove to float down beneath their light to be able to ask them to dinner. Totally not true. There is nothing unspiritual about saying to someone, hey, I really think you're interesting, or hey, I find you attractive. Do you think that I could get your number and we could, set something up to have dinner next week? It really can be that simple at times. We don't always have to overthink asking somebody out. Now, if you don't see anyone around you, if there's no one in your immediate circle that's sort of striking your fancy, finding a date might mean letting your friends and family know that you really are looking and that you really would like to be set up and that you would go on a blind date. It might mean changing your patterns, so whether that's like going to different grocery stores or different restaurants. It might mean opening yourself up to other places to meet people. It might mean online dating, which is totally normal today. It might mean speed dating, which I've done and will now tell you about. So, was not very productive in terms of finding a person. However, it was pretty fun. Because it's amazing how people show up. So they line up all the women, you sit down, and then the men sit down across from you. They talk to you for like 3 to 5 minutes, and then the gong goes off, and then they rotate on down, and you mark on a card, I like you, do you like me? And then if it matches, they give you each other's information at the end of the night. It's shocking how people show up on a date. One guy sits down in front of me, and he's like, do you want to go first? And I was like, no, I don't want to go at all now, because clearly you don't want to be here. But my favorite was this guy sits down across from me, good-looking, well-dressed guy, sits down, we're talking, and he says for a profession that he does taxidermy. So I get super excited, and I was like, that's amazing. And he looks at me and blinks, just like that. I'm like, oh, that's awkward. So I started asking him some more questions. Like, so do you like trap the animals, or do you just stuff them? Is it a machine that stuffs them? Like, how does that work? Stares at me, blinking. I was like, you did say taxidermy, right? And he goes, no, I'm a tax attorney. I was like, oh, that's a little different. But I'm like, come on, that's funny. Like, this could be a moment for us. But he just wasn't having it. Whatever. Sometimes with dating, we have to be willing to just not take ourselves so seriously. That it's okay to laugh at ourselves. It's okay to have a really bad date. It's okay to go home to your friends and have a glass of wine and be like, that was horrible. It can be not as terrible as it seems. So we want to make sure that we're sort of putting ourselves out there. One of the things, too, is that we often will think we know what we want, And we like to think that we know what that is, but the greatest barrier to finding who you actually want to be with is thinking you already know who that is. That we can really get sidetracked when people don't meet the ideal that we already have in our minds. Many of our generation, we're really looking for that soulmate, that perfect fit, that right person. And we can tend to look at dating like a race, where we're trying to get through as many people as possible until we find that one person. And you can go about it that way. But when you do that, you really miss out on the opportunity to get to know the people right in front of you. Because often when we have a list of they need to have these qualities and these characteristics and this type of family, that whenever we're on a date, then we're looking at our list, and rather than getting to know the person in front of us, we've sort of reduced them to a list of characters. Like, okay, he is funny, okay, does have a job, great, don't like his shoes. And all of a sudden, they're not a person who's worth getting to know, which has intrinsic value. All of a sudden, they're a list of qualities that we aren't looking for. And we really miss the image of God in people when we do that. We really miss the opportunity to actually enjoy ourselves while dating, when we're sort of combing through everyone, just trying to find one specific person. Now, there's nothing wrong with having standards. Obviously, we want to have standards. We want to have certain things that we're looking for in someone. But when our standards become a list of rules that other people have to meet in order to date us, we're missing the heart and the fun of dating. Now, some of you may have heard of the comic Aziz Ansari. He is on Parks and Rec, does some stand-up. Well, he wrote a book this year that some of you might have read. It's called Modern Romance. And he teamed up with a sociologist, and the two of them surveyed thousands of people across America to see some dating and romantic life trends, predominantly with people in their 20s and 30s. It was a really fascinating read. And one of the things that they concluded is that 50 years ago, when people wanted to get married, they were really looking for companionship. But today, we have a much different standard of what we're looking for in relationships. So here's a quote from the book. Marriage used to be an economic institution in which you were given a partnership for life in terms of children and social status and succession and companionship. But now we want our partner to still give us all these things, but in addition, I want you to be my best friend and my trusted confidant and my passionate lover to boot. So we come to one person, and basically we're asking them to give us what once an entire village used to provide. Give me belonging, give me identity, give me continuity, but give me transcendence and mystery and awe all in one. Give me comfort and edge, give me novelty, give me familiarity, give me predictability, give me surprise. And we think it's a given that we'll get all these things along with toys and lingerie. And we walk in with all these unspoken expectations. How is anybody supposed to give us all of those things? There's a myth that says that there is a right person for you, and that once you find your right person, everything's going to be okay. And the myth isn't that there's a right person for you. The myth is that everything's going to be fine once you find them. So you can find the right person. You can find someone that matches all of your line items of what you want, but you're still going to be longing for the transcendence and the awe and the predictability, because no one can meet all of those desires and needs. So looking for the right person is a great thing. It just isn't the only thing that makes your relationship work. Where sometimes it thinks if we can just get to the person, then it'll be okay. And there is a beauty that comes in finding that person, but it's not the only thing. Now, if you're a Christian and someone asks you, what are you looking for in a partner? A lot of times we'll say things like, well, I want him to love God. I want her to pray with me. I want to read scripture with her. I want to make sure that they're involved in church and they go to Bible study. And all of those things are great things. And we want to know that someone has a thriving relationship with Jesus. But often those are the only things that we're looking for. And so we want to have spiritual filters on and relational filters. Sometimes we can look at the external spiritual so much we miss the relational red flags. So we also want to ask questions like, are they kind? Will they work out issues with me? Are they controlling? Can they handle the word no? Do they hold grudges? Do I enjoy being around this person? Do they show care and affection for me? A friend of mine once asked my boyfriend at the time, what's Caitlin's love language? I'm sure you heard of the 5 love languages, like whatever they are. acts of service and touch and not taste, but that is just what came to my mind. It's a whole other sermon. Yeah, well, there's quality time. There's 5 of them. And so my boyfriend at the time said, oh, I think it's acts of service. I think it's, might be words of affirmation. And she goes, wrong. It is all 5, all the time, right? Which is how it can feel sometimes, right? But they don't need to love you with all 5 love languages, but we want to know that people are really caring for us and willing to seek to care for us. So all this to say, we need to have spiritual and relational filters on. So let's say you find a person, you're intrigued by them, you want to ask them out. How do you actually ask them out? Well, there's a variety of mediums. You could do face-to-face, phone call, or text. I was reading this week that if you're over 30, you're most likely to go for phone call. If you're under 30, you're most likely to text. And I'm not going to knock any one of the various mediums, but they do have various advantages and disadvantages to them. So the advantage to face-to-face is that you can read their body language, you can tell how it's going over. If it comes out awkward, which totally happens when we're asking people out sometimes, you have the social cues to see it, and then you can rectify it. Text messaging just isn't as forgiving. The thing that's nice is you can write out your sentence and be clear and send it, but then you're just sort of waiting in this eternity, waiting for somebody to respond. You're like, I know you read it, but nobody's responding. So they have pluses and minuses. Text messaging also, if you're not great with spelling or grammar, can make your spelling or grammar a deal breaker in a time where if you had just waited a few weeks to text them, it wouldn't be a deal breaker anymore. My mother-in-law got this t-shirt for Christmas. You had me at the proper use of your. And there are people who really will not want to date people because of their spelling and their grammar. So just be mindful of that with text messaging. So if you are going to ask someone out, especially in a text, the best way to do it is a firm invitation to do something at a specific time. Nobody likes the, hey, text. Who knows what to do with it? Hey, what happens with that? So with texting, you want to say, instead of like, hey, what's happening, what's going on, you want to say something like, hey, Katie, it was great meeting you the other night. Would love to take you to dinner next week. Let me know if you're free. She knows it's a date. He knows it's a date. As much as we can facilitate that process of both people knowing whether it's a date or not, it really helps in the dating process. When we say things like, do you want to hang out? Nobody knows what that means. Do you want to study with me? Nobody knows what that means. The whole time you'll be wondering, is this a date? Is this not a date? Rather than, oh, am I enjoying myself? So if we can be clear, helps the whole process. The other thing with text is we want to watch is that it doesn't become the endless back and forth where there's the flirtation, but nobody ever asks anybody out. So firm invitation to do something at a specific time. So someone can give a clear yes or a no to a clear question. Helps things out dramatically. So let's say someone said yes, you're going on a date. What do you do on a first date? So the old standby, obviously dinner, is great. But what works really well for a first date is if you can create some kind of shared experience with the other person. Sometimes dinner can feel more like that job interview where it's the ask and answer question back and forth. And if you create an experience where you do something together, you're still getting to know them, but with much less pressure. So you could do bocce ball or a monster truck rally, or food tasting, or a painting and wine night, or if you can do some kind of activity, walk around a farmer's market, it can help the conversation flow. And if you're walking side by side, it actually helps conversation flow more than when you're staring at someone directly. So if you're nervous about that piece, try to do something that has like an activity with it. That can really help. The other thing to do is we can prepare. We can make a list of questions to ask somebody before the date. See, it's funny, but here's the thing is that a lot of times we're like, I don't know what to ask someone. So then we don't ever ask them out, and then we're upset that we're single. So there's certain things that we can do to help the process out, like making a list of questions to ask someone, or thinking about funny stories that, killed with your friends. You're like, oh, this one will really be good for this person. A lot of times we can, psych ourselves out. Where is this going? What does this mean? Does this person like, you really want to sort of calm those questions and instead be like, oh, am I having a good time? And then you can ask all those questions later. But on the first date, on the first night, we don't need the big existential questions. We can just kind of, am I enjoying myself? And that's enough for that night. And the other thing with dating, there's plenty of room for errors, and there's plenty of room for mistakes. A lot of times with dating, we feel this pressure to be perfect, to plan the perfect night, to say the perfect thing. And if we tell one bad story or one bad joke, it can feel like, oh no, I've blown the whole thing. There's plenty of room for errors. When my parents were dating, my dad had a cherry tomato on the end of his fork, and he bit down on it in such a way that the skin peeled back and all the gushy, like middle part squirted out across the table and went down the front of my mom's sweater, white sweater. And they still got married. It's totally fine. When I was dating who would eventually be my husband, we went on a date, and it was fairly early in the evening, and he made a joke, and I got my feelings hurt. And I'm thinking, okay, this is the first date. I don't want to be like a total weenie, so I'm trying to like suck it up. I'm fine, whatever. It didn't really hurt my feelings. But then halfway through dinner, I'm like, I'm gonna have to say something, because I could just feel myself shutting down, right? So I'm like, okay. So halfway through dinner, I just put my fork like in my meal, and I was like, hey, I'm sorry. I just have to say something that when you made this joke earlier, it actually really hurt my feelings, and I think I need to talk about it. And he goes, okay. And it was awkward for a minute because we didn't know each other that well, and we're kind of looking at each other, and we start sort of figuring out what happened. And then we kind of resolve it, and then we get in the car to go to the next part of our date, and I could still tell that I wasn't over it. I'm like, oh gosh, why am I not okay? So finally I was like, hey, do you mind if we just don't talk for like 20 minutes so I can figure out what's going on with me? And he's like, sure, let's just roll down the windows, we'll turn up the music, let me know when you're ready. Like, great. So we get to our destination, we get out of the car, and it really did give me enough time to figure out what was happening. And so I said, hey, I was just really excited to go out with you, and when you made this joke, I thought you were sort of indicating that you didn't really want to be here, so that hurt my feelings, and now I feel weird. And he goes, oh my gosh, no, I made that joke because I was nervous, and sometimes I just say things. And we're like, oh, that's fine. So obviously, on a first date, you would never put a fight, or you would never put that kind of miscommunication. But it worked. Because of the way that we were able to process through that, it built a level of trust where it was okay to have a conflict in the middle of our first date. So a lot of times we put this pressure where we can't have anything go wrong, but a lot of times when something goes wrong, it actually binds you together in a way that when everything goes perfect doesn't do. So there's plenty of room for error. And part of following Jesus is making mistakes and acknowledging them and moving on from them. So that's a pattern that we can see in our dating as well. Now, at the end of the date, if you don't want to see them again, you don't have to ask them out again. If you don't want to go out again and they ask you, you can say no. A lot of times we feel this pressure like we're supposed to say, would love to see you again, but we don't really want to do that. So we want to make sure that we're not making false promises. If we say, I'm going to call you or I'm going to text you, we want to actually do that. Otherwise, it's lying. And we want... It is. I'm going to call you, but inside I know, no, I'm not. So we want to make sure that we're following through and being as honest as possible. Dating is confusing enough when everybody's being honest. So we want to make sure that we're being honest to help facilitate the process. So you've gone on a first date, went great, you're not totally sure yet. How many dates do you go on before you know? Well, it varies with everybody. And that's the thing with dating, that we want sort of a formula, and it just doesn't work that way. Sometimes it takes a few repeated exposures to someone to really decide that we like them. If you've seen the movie Sisters with Amy Poehler and Tina Fey, which I haven't seen yet, but when I first saw the preview, I thought, that looks terrible. I have no desire to see that. But then I started seeing more and more previews, and then different previews, and then I saw Tina Fey on the Ellen DeGeneres show, and I thought, do I want to see that? And then I look it up on Rotten Tomatoes, and it's a 66. I'm like, okay, maybe I will go see it. And sometimes it works that way with dating, where we have a so-so first date, and then you go on a second date, and you're like, oh, maybe I do kind of like them. And then by the third date, like, yeah, this is great. Because initially we're attracted to people because of how they look and because of their more showy personality traits. But the things that really make us fall in love with somebody are the more subtle, sustained qualities that they have that a lot of times we don't see until we spend more time with them. So, and with the first date, often we know so little about the other person that we can overweight the few details that we know. So even like the girl in the video who's like, he had a dinky backpack, like you can come back from that if you have a couple dates, you know? I don't know that you can come back from sticking her with the bill, but that's all right. Speaking of which, I went on a date once, it was set up, and he texted me that he was like 20 minutes early. I'm like, I'm not ready yet. I was gonna meet you there at 7. So I show up. The date was pretty bad. I had scallops and there was only 4, so I'm done in like 3 seconds. And he had this big thing of salmon, which he was eating with his fork and his knife like this, like prying it apart. And I'm like, I don't know what to do in this moment. But my favorite part was at the end. He pulls out his credit card to pay, which I really appreciated. But he's like, this one's on daddy, and tosses down the card. And I'm still not sure if it was his dad's credit card or if he was referring to himself as daddy. Up to you, I'm not really sure. So let's say you've been on a few dates and you decided, this isn't the person for me. You really can just say, hey, I'm just not that interested. Sometimes, if it's just been a couple dates, it doesn't have to be a big, huge ordeal. It doesn't have to have a big, like, closure conversation. It can just be, hey, I'm just not interested in you in that way. So we want to communicate that as soon as possible. One of the interesting pieces from the Modern Romance book, which is the Aziz Ansari, is that the number 1 and number 2 way that people in their 20s break up with people is silence and pretend busyness. We can do way better than that. We really want to treat people with dignity and with respect. And that's, if we're ignoring them or pretending like we have plans every night till they get the hint, we can really do way better. That's not respecting them, that's not treating them with dignity. And we really want to be a people who do that. When we're ending it, we don't want to say it's just not the right timing. When we say that, the other person hears, hey, maybe try again in a few weeks. Hey, maybe try again in a couple months. And it leaves them on the hook, which isn't fair. So we want to make sure we're giving clear yeses and clear nos. And you can always change your mind. I'd been on 2 dates with someone, ended it 3 weeks later, find myself thinking about him. I'm like, oh, shoot. So I waited another week just to make sure that I wasn't, just lonely and just wanting someone to call. And it still was there, so I call him. And I totally thought I was going to voicemail. It rang like 8 times, and then of course he picks up on the last ring, and I'm like, oh gosh, I wasn't ready. So he picks up, I was like, hey, it's Caitlin, hadn't talked to you in a while, was wondering if maybe you would want to grab dinner, go to Disneyland. This was when I lived in Southern California. That would be weird if I was asking someone to Disneyland right now. Do you want to go on a weekend away? So he goes, yes, definitely. And this is when I knew that I liked him. He pauses and he goes, I am curious though, I didn't think I was going to see you again. What shifted? And I kind of mumbled around for a couple sentences, and then I said, honestly, at the end of the day, I just changed my mind. And if you're okay that I changed my mind, I really would like to get to know you again. And he goes, okay. And that was that. There has to be room in our dating to be confused, to not be sure, to change our minds, to have it be messy. There has to be room for us to have grace for ourselves and the other person. Everybody finds dating confusing. And anyone who says otherwise is probably lying. Like, there's just something of trying to figure yourself out, figure out another person, see if you match, that's naturally nebulous and gray, and there has to be room for us to be in process while we're dating people. So let's say that you've been going on dates, and you've sort of been on the same date and it's not clicking. What do you do then? Well, there's a few things you can try. One, you can look at the last chunk of people that you've dated and sort of look at them and go, is there a pattern here? Is there a theme here? It's like last week when Abby was talking about the blueprint, that a lot of times we're naturally habituated to date one type of person, which may or may not be the kind of person that would actually work well with us. So we want to look at patterns. Do we see anything similar between the type of people that we're dating? And then we want to give ourselves permission to mix up the routine. If you always initiate, maybe you hang back. If you never initiate, maybe you initiate. If you've never asked a friend out, maybe try asking a friend out. If you've never asked a stranger out, maybe you try asking a stranger out. If you've never tried online dating, maybe you try that. That we have to be the kind of people who are willing to risk if we really do want to be in a relationship. We want to make sure that we're partnering again with God in that process. And God will guide us as we're dating. Sort of like GPS, when you're driving along and you miss a turn and it says, rerouting. It's okay to go on a bad date. Just, okay, that one didn't work. Let's try something else. So my hope is that in a talk that was this practical on dating, that might be helpful to some of you. But I'm also aware of the reality that many of you have likely done so many of these things. We're like, I've put myself out there. I've asked people out. I put myself in a position to date, and there's still nothing. What do you do in that space? Well, a lot of times in that space, we'll lie to ourselves, and we'll say things like, well, something must be wrong with me. And we start figuring ourselves out and trying to psychoanalyze every single thing that we do, because if we can just find the thing that's wrong with us, then we can fix it, and then maybe the next person will want to be with us. And that's not always the case. And even if there is something to work on in your character, even if there's some part of you that needs to be healed, that isn't necessarily the reason why you're single. A lot of times we're trying to find that reason, especially as people are peppering us with cliches and saying things like, my favorite was always, maybe you should just date Jesus for now. Like, that's not a thing. That's not real. It doesn't make any sense. How do you do that? And it's always from a married person, and you're like, shh, you don't know. You don't know what it's like. Or people will say, well, the minute you stop looking, that's when God's going to give you your person. I heard your groan. Yes, totally. It's the worst. And you're like, really? As soon as I stop exerting any kind of effort, then God's going to do something? That makes a lot of sense. So there's these things that people say where they're trying to be helpful. And sometimes we think to ourselves, well, I don't want to be in a relationship anyway. And we try to pretend that we don't want to be in one, and we distance ourselves from the desire for the thing that we really want. It's really okay to want to be in a relationship. Male, female, doesn't matter. It's okay to want to be in a relationship, and it's okay to be sad that you're not in one. We don't have to pretend like, woohoo, I love being single. Some of you might, and that's awesome. But there's a lot of people who aren't happy, and that's okay to say. Sometimes if we'll start lying about other people too. We'll make these massive generalizations, and we'll find ourselves saying things like, well, all women are crazy, or all men are jerks. And then we rail against men because they don't initiate enough, and then men rail against women saying, well, they don't let us pursue them. And everybody's just pointing the finger at everybody else because nobody wants to acknowledge the fact that it's just so hard to put yourself in a place for someone to fall in love with you. It's so difficult to be in that place, and we say things like dating is hard, and it is. But also, life is hard. Like, life takes an incredible amount of stamina and strength and tenacity to follow after God when we don't have the life that we want. And yet, we're still called to follow him in that place and in that space. So, in prayer, we can tell God how angry we are, how disillusioned we are, how disappointed we are, and how much we want a relationship, and how there is just some mysterious component to it that we can't control, which is why it's so beautiful when someone loves you and you love them in return, and why it's so horrible when it doesn't work out, because there's some mysterious element to it. And we want to be the people who are as proactive as possible and initiate as much as possible. And we also want to recognize that that's not going to solve every one of the difficulties with dating. There's a line in the Gospels where Jesus says, "Blessed are those who don't stumble on account of me." And he's basically saying, blessed are those who follow me when it doesn't make sense. Blessed are those who follow me when they're mad at me. Blessed are those who follow me when they're really disappointed. Blessed are those who are longing for things that aren't yet fulfilled. And that's part of, as hard and sad as it is, that's part of what we're called to do. So the underlying question is, who am I going to be when I don't have what I want? How am I going to follow Christ in having these unrequited desires, or having this longing for a relationship that I'm not in yet? But good things can happen to us and for us in this waiting time. So let's take action and be responsible and partake with God and take actionable steps to improve our dating life. And let's trust that God is guiding us in the process. And he's with us, and he's for us, and he wants the relationship for us and that we can trust him to deliver on that in the right timing. Let's go ahead and pray. God, it is no easy thing to follow you when we don't have all the pieces of our life that we want to have. But we just declare before you now that we trust you. We know that you're good. We know that you're competent. We know that you can guide us as we're dating. So would you strengthen us? Would you sharpen us? Would you give us hope? Would you encourage us to believe you that you are good and that you can fulfill all your promises to us? And for everyone in this room tonight, God, that is longing to be in a relationship, would you grant that? Would you make that possible for them, that they could really find a meaningful, sustaining relationship? And we ask these things in your Son's name. Amen.
Thanks, Caitlin. You're funny.